At the age of 66, Randy Travis is not just a name but a living memory of America, a person who helped reshape traditional country music over many decades, with the album Storms of Life, released in 1986, becoming one of the best-selling country albums of all time, taking him from an unknown artist to a national icon. A series of songs like Forever and Ever, Amen, on the other hand, or Deeper Than the Holler, not only topped the charts but also entered the cultural life of millions of people. He won 7 Grammy Awards, more than 20 #1 singles, many platinum and gold albums, and became a member of the Grand Ole Opry and later was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. Those achievements are not measured only by numbers, but also by the profound influence on the next generation of artists. From young voices to legends of his time, his warm and truthful voice has become the standard for authentic country, a symbol of simplicity, faith, and genuine emotion that America has always cherished. But behind all that glory is a pain that no stage could hide. When in 2013, a stroke took away his voice, the thing that had made his entire life, turning a man who once commanded sound into someone who had to struggle with every word, every movement. He could no longer sing as before. Even simple communication became a challenge. And the cruelest thing was not losing fame, but having to keep living while knowing that the most important part of himself was gone. Yet even in that silence, he did not disappear. Step by step, with slow recovery, each public appearance, even if imperfect, he showed a different kind of strength. Not the strength of a star, but the strength of a man who refuses to give up. And that is exactly what makes his story not just a tragedy, but proof of the will to survive when everything else has left. Before moving forward into the story behind that silence, please hit like and leave a heart as a way of respect for a voice that once lifted up millions of people. And if you believe that there are people who still deserve to be heard even when they can no longer raise their voice, please subscribe to the channel to follow together the painful but resilient journey of his in the next part. Randy Travis's childhood did not begin with music, but with deprivation. Long days in the rural area of North Carolina, where life had no room for big dreams, only fields, dusty roads, and families struggling every day to survive. In the small house where he grew up, everything was harsh in a very quiet way. Not loud tragedies, but prolonged deprivation that crept into every meal, every old set of clothes, every look from adults when talking about the future of children like him. His father was a stern man to the point that there was almost no room for gentleness. A man who believed discipline was the only way to survive. And if necessary, that discipline had to come with unyielding harshness. He was not the kind of father who would hug his child or say encouraging words, but always looked at his son with the expectation that he must become something better. Meanwhile, Randy was the child who could not fit into any mold. The more he was forced, the more he resisted. The more he was controlled, the more he sought to escape. And that conflict turned his childhood into an endless chain of clashes between a boy trying to understand who he was and a father who accepted no answer other than obedience. When he entered his teenage years, Randy was no longer just a rebellious child in the family, but became a familiar name to the local police. Times of being arrested, nights taken to the station, warnings, all gradually became part of his life. Not because he wanted to be the bad guy, but because he did not know any other way to survive in a world where he always felt he did not belong. School was not a place that brought hope, but a place where he was looked at with doubtful eyes, where those around him did not see a clear future in him, but only a boy going in the wrong direction. The seemingly casual words of others became deep scars in his mind that he would never become anyone, that he was just a mistake growing up every day. And when a child hears those things long enough, he begins to believe it is the truth. There were nights Randy came home without knowing where he was going, not because he had no home, but because he did not feel it was a place he could belong. The silence in the family was sometimes heavier than any scolding. And right in that emptiness, something began to form, unclear and unnamed but strong enough to keep him from sliding completely into darkness. That was music. At first, it was just simple melodies and clumsy lyrics, but gradually it became the only place where he felt he could exist without being judged. When he sang, no one asked what he had done wrong. No one mentioned the times he was arrested. No one looked at him as a problem to be solved. Music did not require him to become someone else. It allowed him to be himself, and that, in a life where everything tried to change him, became more precious than anything else. There were moments when standing alone, raising his voice in the quiet space, Randy felt like he was finally being heard, not by others, but by himself. And even though the outside world still continued to see him as a child going the wrong way, even though his father did not change his view, even though the future remained blurry, at least in those melodies he found a reason to continue, not because he knew who he would become, but because for the first time in his life, he felt he was not completely invisible. But even when music had become the final refuge, Randy Travis's life still stood before a turning point where just one wrong step could end everything before it truly began. And right in that fragile moment, he met Elizabeth Hatcher, a woman unlike anyone he had ever known, who did not see him as a rebellious child or a problem that needed fixing, but saw in him something unfinished, yet capable of being shaped. She did not come with comforting words, but with rules, conditions, and a clear path she believed he had to follow if he wanted to escape the life that was gradually swallowing him. At first, it was salvation in a very practical sense. She helped him stay away from legal troubles, pulled him out of self-destructive habits, and brought him into an environment where music was no longer an escape, but a profession that needed serious training. Randy, who had grown used to chaos, began learning how to live with discipline, how to show up on time, how to sing properly, and more importantly, how to control himself. But along with that stability, something else gradually formed. A form of control that did not stop at work. Elizabeth was not just managing his career. She gradually became the one who directed his entire life, from the way he dressed and the way he spoke to his personal decisions. Everything was considered, adjusted, and sometimes imposed. Randy, who once could not stand his father's control, now stepped into a relationship where control existed in a different, more subtle but no less tight form. And what made it complicated was that he knew he needed it. Because every time he tried to decide for himself, everything showed signs of slipping back to the old ways, to the mistakes he had made before. So he accepted it, little by little, giving away control of his life in exchange for a chance he had never had before. His career began to take shape from there. Small performances, rare opportunities, all carefully arranged by Elizabeth. She did not just create opportunities, but also protected him from his own weaknesses. But the price of that protection was dependence. Randy gradually got used to having someone decide for him, used to not having to face difficult choices directly, and over time, the line between being helped and being controlled began to blur. Their relationship was no longer purely professional, but became more personal, deeper, and also more complicated. Because when one person is both the one who saved you from failure and the one who holds nearly your entire life, emotions are no longer simply gratitude, but also attachment, and the pressure not to disappoint them. Randy began to live not only for himself, but for the expectations of the person who had placed faith in him, and that, in a way, continued to take away a part of the freedom he had once tried to find. He was no longer the rebellious boy from years ago, but he had not yet truly become a completely independent person either. Instead, he stood in the middle, pulled in two directions. One side the chaotic past, the other the tightly controlled present. And in that space, he began to lose the ability to listen to himself. Decisions no longer came from personal desires, but from what was considered right, appropriate, and safe. And even though that path led him closer to success, it also quietly took away what he had once found in music in the early days. the feeling of being himself without being shaped by anyone else. And perhaps that was the biggest paradox in this period of his life. The person who had saved him from disappearing was also the one who unintentionally redefined him in a way that he himself had not yet fully understood. And as he continued down that path, Randy Travis carried not only hope for a better future, but also a question that never had an answer: whether he was being saved or gradually becoming a version that he himself had not completely chosen. And then, when the path had been shaped long enough, when the days of being molded, controlled, and refined began to crystallize into something clearer, Randy Travis stepped into the moment when the whole world finally had to listen to him. No longer small stages, no longer endless long nights, but spotlights, recording studios, and the first recordings that carried everything he had been through. And when the album Storms of Life was born, it was not just a music product, but a statement that a voice once overlooked and doubted had now found its place. Songs like On the Other Hand or Forever and Ever, Amen, were not simply successful chart hits, but became melodies that people carried in their daily lives. Because there was no showiness, no fancy techniques to impress, only a deep, raw, and honest voice that made listeners feel like they were hearing their own story. Randy did not try to become a star the way the industry wanted. He just sang in the only way he knew, and that simplicity became what the public had been waiting for so long. In a time when country was gradually blending and losing its identity, his voice pulled everything back to its rightful place, carrying stories of labor, of faith, of ordinary people trying to live through each day. And the listeners did not just hear, they recognized themselves in it. They saw their own struggles named, their emotions that they could not express sung clearly. And therefore, Randy Travis did not just become a successful singer, he became a voice, a symbol of a part of America that was not always seen. The stages grew bigger, the applause grew longer, awards came one after another. Recognition was no longer a luxury, but a daily reality. But amid all of that, one thing still did not change: the emptiness inside him. Because even though the world began to look at him with admiration, even though his name appeared on charts and award shows, the feeling of belonging he had sought since he was a child was still not truly complete. He sang for millions of people, but when he stepped off the stage, he was still a man facing the familiar silence, where there was no music, no lights, only himself and the thoughts he did not easily share with anyone. Success brought many things he had once lacked, but it did not fill everything, and perhaps that made his voice even more special, because in every line he sang, people heard not only technique or melody, but also a void trying to be filled, a loneliness that was unspoken but always present, and that truth made his music feel close, because it did not come from a perfect life, but from a person still searching for the meaning of himself amid everything he had achieved. And when looking from the outside, Randy Travis was the image of a rising legend. But inside, he was still the boy from back then, still trying to understand where he truly belonged in a world that had begun to call his name as an icon. But when the light became too bright, it also began to obscure what was really happening inside. And for Randy Travis, success did not come as a stopping point, but as a wheel that never slowed down. Performances followed one after another. Overnight flights, interviews, packed schedules that made time no longer something he could control. Each passing day was no longer marked by emotion, but by duty, by the places he had to go and the people he had to meet. And while the audience saw a man living at the peak, inside he began to clearly feel a nameless fatigue, not because he no longer loved music, but because he was no longer living for himself. Everything gradually became a long performance where he had to always maintain the image the public expected: a perfect voice, a calm man, a symbol of sincerity. And day by day, the gap between the real person and that image grew so large that he was no longer sure who he was when there were no stage lights. His marriage, which had been built during difficult years, began to face pressure from the very success they had once pursued. Elizabeth Hatcher was not only a companion, but also the one who kept everything running. But that control, when placed in the context of an increasingly stressful life, became the source of gaps that were not easy to mend. They no longer had much time to talk as before, no longer had simple moments where two people could sit down and understand each other. Instead, there were decisions, plans, arguments about what was best for the career. And gradually, what had once bound them together began to pull them apart. Randy began to feel like he was living in a prearranged life where every step had already been calculated, where mistakes were not allowed to happen. And in such a world, he no longer had space to be an ordinary person, no space to make mistakes, to stop, to breathe. And that was exactly what made him feel trapped, not in a specific place, but in the very image he had built. The more successful he became, the harder it was to escape it, because now not only he, but the whole world believed that was his true self. The nights returning after performances, when the hotel room door closed, the silence became heavier than ever. There was no more music, no more applause, only the thoughts he had not had time to face all day. And in those moments, he began to realize that the life he was living did not resemble the life he had once imagined. He had gotten everything an artist could want, but he had lost the things a person needs to feel whole. The balance between work and life gradually disappeared, and in its place was a prolonged state of existence where everything continued but no longer brought the feeling of belonging. Randy Travis, who once sang about sincerity, now faced a reality where he was no longer sure what was real in his own life. And perhaps the most painful thing was not having to live under pressure, but gradually becoming a stranger to himself. When looking at his life and realizing that it no longer resembled the person he once was, no longer the boy who found freedom in music, but a man trying to hold on to an image that even he no longer fully understood. And then, when everything on the outside seemed to have reached its peak, inside Randy Travis's life became increasingly empty in a way that was hard to describe, because success could bring light, but not always a place to return to. And in those years, what he lacked was not audiences, not opportunities, but a feeling of stability that he had never truly had. The marriage that had once been closed now existed only as part of a past that was gradually drifting away. And even though the memories and the years they had built together from the difficult days were still there, the present was no longer close enough to hold everything together. Randy began to live in a rhythm with no stopping point, from one performance to the next, from one city to another, tour buses, flights, and hotel rooms, replacing a real home. Every place he went had lights and applause. But nothing stayed when he left, and over time, he could no longer clearly distinguish where he had once belonged, because no place lasted long enough to become part of him. Life became a series of temporary stops where he only existed long enough to fulfill his responsibilities and then continued moving. And that very continuity made everything fade, with no memory deep enough, no relationship lasting enough. Everything just passed by like the melodies he sang every night, ringing out and then dissolving. The nights after the stage were times no one saw, when the lights went out, when the audience left, when the applause remained only as an echo in memory. He returned to a silence that nothing could fill. The room became too big for one person, and that quiet did not bring peace, but carried a prolonged feeling of emptiness. There were times he sat alone, without turning on music or the television, just to listen to that silence itself, as a way to face what he had tried to avoid all day. And in moments like that, he began to realize that no matter how far he went, no matter how many people he stood in front of, when everything ended, he still had to return to himself. And that was where he felt the most lost, with no family by his side, no simple evenings with loved ones, no one waiting for him to come home except himself. And that did not come suddenly, but accumulated gradually through each year, each trip, each time he chose to continue instead of stopping. Those around him still saw a successful Randy Travis, still saw a country icon, but they did not see the growing gap between the man he was and the life he was living. He did not belong on the stage, even though he spent most of his time there. And he no longer belonged anywhere else either, because the connections that had once existed had gradually faded with time and distance. And perhaps what made it more painful was that he could not point out exactly when everything began to change, with no specific moment, no clear event, only a feeling that became clearer and clearer that he was drifting without an anchor. And even at the peak of his career, even known by millions of people, that loneliness still existed. Not loud, not dramatic, but persistent and not easy to disappear, like a part of life that he could not leave behind. And over time, he no longer tried to fight it, but learned to live with it, the way he had learned to stand on stage and sing for others, while inside he was still searching for a place he could finally call home. And then, when loneliness was no longer fleeting silences but became a fixed part of life, everything began to slip away in a way that even Randy Travis did not notice right from the start. There was no clear moment marking the collapse. No day he woke up and knew everything had changed, but only small parts of life gradually losing their stability, habits being broken, connections becoming loose. And when the marriage with Elizabeth Hatcher came to an end, what he lost was not just a wife, but the final anchor that had kept his life from falling completely into chaos. Because even though that relationship had once been full of pressure and control, it still provided a structure, a framework he had grown used to living in for many years. And when it disappeared, he no longer knew how to maintain his own balance. The freedom he had once longed for now became too vast, too empty, and there was no one there to remind him to stop, no one to adjust the steps that were veering off course. Life began to drift in a different rhythm, slower but more fragmented. Mornings no longer started with clear plans. Evenings no longer ended with the fatigue of work, but instead were times without purpose, where he had to fill them with anything that could ease the growing feeling of emptiness. And in those gaps, alcohol began to appear, at first not as a problem, but as a temporary way to blur the silence, to make thoughts lighter, to turn long nights into more bearable moments. But over time, it was no longer just a choice, but became part of a habit. Something he turned to not because he wanted to, but because he did not know what else to do. The days continued to pass. His career still existed. Songs were still played. Performances still took place, and from the outside everything seemed unchanged. But inside he began to clearly feel the weakening, not of his voice but of himself. Decisions became inconsistent, emotions harder to control, and what had once helped him stand firm discipline no longer held him as before. He did not collapse immediately, did not lose everything in one night, but gradually lost the smallest things first: habits, rhythm of life, clarity of thought. And when those disappeared, bigger things also began to shake. There were moments he realized he was going far from the person he had tried to become, but he did not have enough strength to turn back, because there was no longer anyone there to pull him back like before. And that was exactly what made the slide more frightening. Not because it was too fast, but because it was too slow, too quiet, to the point that when he truly looked back, he was already in a place he no longer recognized. And even though he still stood on stage, even though he was still a familiar name to the public, Randy Travis began to feel like he was playing a role he no longer believed in, a performance maintained by inertia while inside everything was gradually falling apart. And perhaps the most painful thing was not losing what he had, but realizing that he was gradually losing himself without knowing how to stop. And then, when everything had slid far enough from the balance he once had, that night came in a way no one could forget. A night in 2012, when Randy Travis was no longer standing on stage with lights and applause, but appeared in shocking news reports and headlines, not as a music legend, but as a man losing control of his own life. What happened that night was not just a mistake, but the clear revelation of everything that had quietly accumulated over many years. Habits no longer under control, emotions not released, gaps not filled, all bursting out at once, shattering the image he had built throughout his career in a single moment. The press no longer mentioned him as the voice that had once saved a generation, but as a cautionary tale, a fallen icon. The photos that spread no longer brought inspiration but disappointment. Those who had once found comfort in his music now did not know how to look at him, and the public's reaction was not understanding but turning away, because they did not just see a man who made a mistake. They saw an image they had once trusted collapsing right before their eyes. The media continuously exploited, analyzed, and judged, every detail repeated and amplified into a story bigger than the truth itself. And in that world, there was no longer room for what he had once done right, only what he had just done wrong. Randy Travis, who had once controlled every note, now became a name caught in a vortex he could not stop. Criticism came from everywhere, not only from the press, but also from those who had once admired him. And that made the collapse even deeper, because it did not just happen on the outside, but reflected directly inside him, where he had to face the image of himself in others' eyes, an image he did not recognize but also could not deny. There were moments he looked back and wondered how everything had come to this point, not because he did not know he had been wrong, but because he did not understand why he could not stop before it was too late. That night was not just an event, but the point where everything could not return to the way it was. A boundary between the person he once was and the person he became in the eyes of the world. And when everything settled down, when the headlines gradually disappeared from the front pages, what remained was not relief, but a larger emptiness, because fame could be damaged and could be rebuilt. But the feeling of losing control, the feeling of having lost himself in front of the public, was something not easy to make disappear. And in the silence after that storm, Randy Travis not only had to face what he had done, but also the question he had avoided for too long. Who he really was when there were no more lights, when there was no more admiration, when all that remained was one man standing before the consequences of his own life, and when the echoes of the 2012 storm had not yet had time to settle, when the cracks in Randy Travis's life were still clearly marked, then 2013 arrived in a way no one could prepare for, not with a loud public incident, but with a terrifying silence in a hospital room, where everything was no longer under his control. At first there were only signs of unstable health, prolonged fatigue, feelings he might have ignored or thought were temporary. But then everything changed so quickly that no one could understand what was really happening. He was taken to the hospital in serious condition related to his heart, and in a short period of time, the situation worsened in an alarming way. His body, which had already endured so much in the years before, began to react in a way no one could control. The doctors faced a situation that was no longer simple. When the stroke happened, it was not just a medical event, but a clear line dividing his life into two parts, before and after. And in that moment, the man who had once commanded every note and every breath on stage now could no longer command his own body. Reactions that were once natural became slow and fragmented, then gradually disappeared. The signals between his brain and body no longer worked as before. And the scariest thing was not the pain but the silence when his body no longer responded. His family stood before a reality no one wanted to accept. Doctors were forced to talk about the worst possibilities, about low survival rates, about decisions no one was ready to make. There were moments when all hope seemed to exist only in theory, when machines replaced the functions his body could no longer perform, when every heartbeat and every breath became something that needed to be monitored and maintained by technology. And in that space, where there was no music, no lights, only the sound of machines and the hurried footsteps of nurses, a life hung suspended between existing and disappearing. His loved ones had to stand and watch without being able to do anything except wait. Wait for a sign, a reaction, something that proved he was still there. But time did not stand still, and every hour that passed carried greater uncertainty. Randy Travis was no longer the one in charge of his own story, but became someone swept along by events he could not control. His body no longer responded to his will, no longer performed the things he had once done naturally, from speaking and moving to the most basic functions. Everything became fragile, and right in that state, a new life began, not as a continuation of what had been, but as a completely different existence, where every day was a challenge. Every small sign of recovery was tiny enough to be overlooked, and every moment carried the question of whether he could return or not. But that question gradually became no longer relevant, because when a body had crossed such a boundary, the issue was no longer about returning to the way it was, but whether it could continue to exist in some way. And in that fragility, between the equipment and the predictions, between hope and reality, Randy Travis stepped into the most difficult phase of his life, a phase with no stage, no music, no audience, only one man trying to hold on to life while everything else was gradually leaving him. And then, when the days in the hospital were no longer counted by hours but by endless stretches of silence, Randy Travis woke up in a world that even he did not recognize, a world where his body no longer obeyed his will, where things that had once been instinct now became insurmountable challenges. After the stroke, he could no longer speak as before, could no longer stand up, walk, or raise his voice to sing naturally. Every movement was slowed down and fragmented, as if there was an invisible gap between thought and action that he could not close. What made everything more painful was not that he did not understand what was happening, but that he understood it very clearly, yet could not express it. His awareness was still there. The memories, the melodies, the lyrics he had once known by heart still echoed in his mind. But when he tried to turn them into sound, his body did not respond. Words got stuck, sentences could not be completed, and silence became an inseparable part of his new life. The man who had once commanded the stage was now trapped inside his own body, not because he no longer wanted to live, but because he no longer had a way to show that he was still alive. There were times he tried to move, tried to speak, and when his body did not respond, his eyes revealed a helplessness that no words could describe. It was not explosive despair, but a dull, lingering pain that repeated every day, every time he realized that the simplest things were now out of reach. The inability to sing was not just losing a career, but losing a part of his identity, because music was not just something he did, but something he was. And when that disappeared, he lost not only his voice, but the only way he'd ever used to connect with the world. Around him, people tried to help with therapy sessions, exercises, and efforts to restore each small function. But every progress was so slow it was almost imperceptible. And that made the journey longer and heavier, because there was no clear milestone, no moment when he could say he had overcome it, only days following one another. Each day the same, each day demanding a patience not everyone could maintain. Randy Travis had to relearn things he had never thought he would forget: how to move, how to pronounce words, how to exist in a body that was no longer the same. And in that process, he faced not only the limits of his body, but also the limits of himself. There were times the exhaustion came not from the physical, but from having to accept that the old life was gone, that the man who had once stood on stage and sung for millions could not return as before. And that was not a temporary phase, but a lasting reality, a reality he had to live with every day, with no other choice, no way back, only one path: to keep moving forward, however slow, however difficult, however uncertain. And in that silence, in a body that no longer obeyed, Randy Travis began a different journey. Not to become a star, but to hold on to what remained of himself, little by little, in a world he no longer controlled but still had to learn how to exist in. While everything around seemed to be stopping, while Randy Travis's body no longer responded to his will, while even those who understood the situation clearly began preparing for the worst possibilities, there was one person who still stood there, not leaving, not wavering, and not accepting an end the way others had already imagined. Mary Davis did not enter his life as a loud character, but became the one who held on to what was left when everything was gradually leaving. In the early days in the hospital, when doctors talked about low survival rates, when difficult choices were presented, she did not just listen, but made decisions not everyone had the courage to make. She chose to continue, chose to fight, not because she was certain he would recover, but because she believed he was still there, even if his body could not prove it. And that belief became the only anchor in a phase where everything else was uncertain. Mary was not just by his side. She was present in every moment, from the days he lay motionless to the smallest attempts at response, from holding his hand and talking to him to monitoring every tiny change. She did not measure progress by big steps, but by signs others might overlook. A blink, a slight movement, a slow reaction, and in a world where everything had become fragile, those small things became proof that the fight was still going on. The recovery journey did not happen the way people usually imagine, with no miraculous moments, no sudden changes, only repetition, day after day, exercises, efforts, failures, and trying again. Randy had to relearn everything, and Mary was there in every step, not only to support, but to remind him that he was not alone. There were days with no progress, times when everything seemed to go back to the starting point, and in those moments what kept them going was not the result but the persistence. Mary did not force him to become like before. She did not set unrealistic expectations, but accepted him in his current state while still believing he could go further. And that balance helped the journey not become a burden, but a process he could walk step by step, however slow, however difficult. Randy, who had once been used to being in control of everything, now had to rely on others to do the simplest things, and that was not easy to accept. But Mary's presence made it possible, not because it reduced the helplessness, but because it meant that helplessness no longer had to be faced alone. Over time, changes began to appear. Not clear, not strong, but enough to make a difference. He could make sounds, react faster, perform movements he could not before. Each step forward was small, but carried meaning far greater than its size, because each step was the result of uninterrupted persistence, of days with no results but still continuing. Mary did not just help him survive, but helped him find a new way to exist. A way not based on what had been lost, but on what still remained. And in that journey, love was not shown through grand words, but through persistent presence, through staying when things became the hardest. And that was exactly what kept Randy Travis from disappearing completely, not in the physical sense, but in the human sense. Because in a body that was no longer the same, in a life that had completely changed, he still had an anchor, a reason to continue. And even though the road ahead was not clear, even though no one knew how far he could go, the fact that he was still there, still existing, still moving forward in small steps, was something not everyone could do. And then, amid those slow but persistent steps forward, a truth gradually became clearer every day. A truth that no one said out loud, but everyone understood, that Randy Travis would never return to the way he was before, not because he did not try, not because he lacked willpower, but because his body had crossed a boundary that could not be reversed. The voice that had once been his identity, that had once been where he existed most clearly in this world, could no longer come back in the way he had once known. At first, that did not come as a clear conclusion, but as a vague feeling, an emptiness when he tried to produce sound and realized it no longer matched his memories. Then gradually, as time passed and the improvement did not bring what he had once hoped for, that feeling became acceptance. Not easy acceptance, but a long process where he had to face exactly what he had lost. There were days he sat listening to old recordings, songs where his voice had once rang out strong and full, carrying all the emotion he had once put into them. And in those moments, he did not just hear the music. He heard himself from a time that had passed, a person who now seemed very far away, not in distance, but in the ability to reach. Each lyric became a vivid memory, but also a reminder that he was no longer that person. The gap between the past and the present was no longer something that could be narrowed, but became clearer. Like two parallel worlds where he could only stand on one side and look toward the other. There were times the memories brought warmth, but there were also times they made the pain deeper, because they showed clearly what had once existed and what no longer did. And in that journey, Randy not only learned how to recover physically, but also learned how to accept a form of loss that could not be compensated. He no longer tried to become the person he once was, because he understood that was no longer possible. Instead, he began to find a way to exist in the person he was becoming. A person not perfect, not whole in the old way, but still able to continue living, still able to find meaning in small things. Life did not stop. Even though an important part had disappeared, the days still passed. Mornings still came. Ordinary moments began to carry a different meaning, no longer measured by big achievements, but by simple things like a more complete conversation, a steadier step, a day without too much fatigue. And in all of that, he gradually realized that even though the voice was gone, life still continued. Not in the way he had once imagined, not in the way he had once wanted, but it still continued. And the hardest thing was not losing a part of himself, but learning how to live when that part was no longer there. Not trying to replace it, not trying to deny it, but accepting that it had once existed, had once made him who he was. And now, even though it was no longer present, it was still an inseparable part of who he was. And right in that acceptance, even though it did not bring complete joy, it brought a quiet form of peace, enough for him to keep moving forward, day by day, in a life that had changed but had not ended. And then, in a moment when no one really knew what to expect, Randy Travis appeared before the public once again, not as the familiar image of a legend standing in the middle of the stage with a full and confident voice, but as a man stepping out with limits that anyone could see but no one could fully understand. It was a major event where the lights were still bright, where the audience still filled the hall, but the atmosphere was different. Not the excitement waiting for a perfect performance, but a respectful silence, as if everyone knew they were witnessing something beyond music. When he stood there, time seemed to slow down. Each step, each movement carried the traces of a long and painful journey. And then, in the moment when no one dared to be sure what would happen, he raised a few lines of song. Not a complete song, not a full performance. Just short words, imperfect sounds, but enough to make the entire hall hold its breath, because it was no longer the voice they had once known, but the remaining trace of something that had once been very big and very powerful, and was now trying to exist in a different way. The notes were not round or true to the listener's memories, but that very imperfection carried a weight that no perfect performance could create, because in each sound people heard the effort, the pain, and the will not to disappear. There were people in the hall who could not hold back their tears, not because they were hearing a good song, but because they were witnessing a man fighting to hold on to the last thing left of himself. And when the lines of song ended, there was no clear ending, no climax, only a long silence, a quiet that no one wanted to break, because any sound at that moment could take away the meaning of what had just happened. And in that silence, emotion rose in a way that needed no explanation, no guidance, only the presence of a man who had gone through so much loss. The audience did not stand up right away, did not applaud loudly, but held on to that moment a little longer, as if they needed time to understand that what they had just seen was not a performance but a testimony, a statement that even though he was no longer perfect, no longer as before, he was still there, still existing, still finding a way to connect with the world in the way he could. And when the final applause rang out, it no longer carried the meaning of praise, but of recognition. Recognition for the journey, for the effort, for the fact that he had stood there facing everything without hiding, without pretending. And right in that moment, the image of Randy Travis changed in the eyes of the public. No longer a legend remembered for what he had done, but a man cherished for what he was still trying to do. And that, in a way, was even stronger than any song he had ever sung in the past. After that moment, when the lights gradually dimmed and the applause settled down, Randy Travis's life did not return to big stages or long tours like before, but quietly flowed in a completely different rhythm, slower, quieter, and also more closed off. His days were no longer marked by packed schedules or long performance hours, but by repeated therapy sessions, small exercises aimed at keeping what his body could still do. Every movement, every sound required a patience he had never had to think about before. There were no more stage lights, no more thousands of eyes watching. His life shrank into familiar spaces where time no longer flowed quickly but stretched out in every moment. And in that quiet, he learned how to exist in a way he had never known before, not by conquering anything more, but by holding on to what remained. Mornings began slowly, without rushing, without flights to catch on time, only careful steps, short conversations, and longer, more frequent rests as an inevitable part of the new life. Mary Davis was still there, not as a manager or a guide, but as a companion, going through every day and every phase with him, without needing grand words, only presence. And in that smaller world, family was no longer something he missed, but became the center of everything, where he found the stability he had never had before. Even if it came late, even if it was not complete in the way he had once imagined, but still enough to bring a feeling of belonging. The memories did not leave. They remained present in every small detail, in old songs played again, in stories mentioned, in the eyes of those who had known him before. There were times he sat in silence, as if listening to something only he could hear, perhaps a familiar melody, perhaps a memory from years gone by. And even though he could no longer recreate them as before, he still kept them with him as an inseparable part of who he was. Randy Travis's life now was no longer measured by success or failure, but by continuation, by existence, and by the ability to adapt to a reality that had completely changed. He was no longer the man standing on stage, but he also did not disappear from the world. He existed in a space in between, where the past and the present coexisted, where what had been lost was not forgotten but also did not prevent him from continuing to live. And in that silence, with no singing, no music in the way he had once known, there was still another kind of sound, gentler and more private. The sound of a man still moving forward, day by day, in a life no longer as before, but still there, still continuing, in a way not everyone could understand, but everyone could feel. And when looking back at that entire journey, Randy Travis's life does not appear as a straight line leading to glory, but like a vortex of rises and losses, of moments that seemed to touch the peak, but right after fell into a deeper emptiness. He started as a boy in North Carolina whom no one expected to become anything great, a rebellious and lost child judged to have no future. And right from that starting point, he stepped into a journey no one could predict. Met Elizabeth Hatcher, was saved from his mistakes, was guided onto the path of music, but at the same time stepped into a life where everything gradually was shaped by others, where he had to learn to become a better version of himself, but was not completely free to decide who he was. Then from there, his voice rang out, not loud, not showy, but deep and truthful, touching people who had never known him, taking him from small stages to bright lights, from an unknown name to a country icon. The awards, the songs topping the charts, the recognition from both the industry and the audience, all seemed to prove that he had overcome his past, that he had become something no one before believed was possible. But along with that were losses not easy to recognize right away. The distances in relationships, the prolonged loneliness even when standing among thousands of people, the broken marriage, his personal life gradually losing balance, and right when he had everything an artist could want, he began to feel like a stranger to his own life. Then, in the years after, when no one was keeping him in check anymore, when old habits returned, he gradually slid into a state of losing control that he could not stop. The mistakes, the scandals, the moments when the public no longer looked at him with admiration but with disappointment. And that was when he faced another form of loss, losing the image he had built throughout his career. But all of that, no matter how painful, was still not the biggest turning point, because the real event came when his body was no longer his, when the stroke in 2013 not only threatened his life, but took away his voice, the thing that had been tied to him from the very beginning. And from then on, everything changed completely. He was no longer the man standing on stage, no longer the one raising melodies that moved people's hearts, but became a person who had to relearn from the start how to speak, how to walk, how to exist in a body that no longer responded as before. That change did not happen in one day, but stretched through months and years. Each day was a confrontation with a new reality, where he could not return to the old self, could not restore what had been lost, and had to learn to accept that his life would never be the same again. But in all those losses, there was one thing that did not disappear: the person inside him, the willpower that had once helped him overcome a difficult childhood and his mistakes, was still there, no longer expressed through his voice but through persistence, through the fact that he continued to get up every day, continued to move forward even if slowly, continued to appear before the public even if not perfect. What remained was not fame, not achievements, but a man who still existed, who still kept a part of himself even though most of it had changed. And perhaps that is what makes his story different, because he does not represent a perfect victory, is not the image of overcoming everything to return to the way he was, but is proof that a person can continue to live even when he cannot return to who he once was. In the final image, there are no more bright lights, no more big stages, only a man walking slowly with limits that anyone can see, but also with a strength that not everyone understands. A man who lost his voice but did not lose his soul. And in that silence, in a very different way, he is still being heard. The story of Randy Travis not only makes people feel sorrow for what he has lost, but also makes them stop and think about how a person can continue to exist after the most important part of himself has been taken away. From a rebellious boy in North Carolina seen as having no future, to a voice that once revived traditional country with storms of life and hits like Forever and Ever, Amen, then falling into days of being lost after the divorce and the 2012 scandal, and finally, the peak being the stroke in 2013 that took away his voice, the thing that had defined his entire life. Every detail in that journey is not just a separate event, but layers of pressure piled up, from a deprived childhood, the prolonged control in the relationship with Elizabeth Hatcher, to the feeling of loneliness even at the peak of fame. And what makes the story heartbreaking is not that he once fell, but that he had to learn how to keep living in a body that no longer responded as before, had to face his own voice through old recordings without being able to touch it again, had to accept that the gap between the past and the present would never be narrowed. But right in that silence, the image of him standing on stage, singing a few imperfect lines of amazing grace, became the strongest proof of human value, because it showed that strength does not lie in perfection, but in not disappearing. And for the American people, a place that values the individual, resilience, and the ability to stand up after failure, this story is a reminder that success is not about keeping everything, but about still keeping yourself when everything has changed. That family and the people who stay by our side, like the way Mary Davis did, are the real anchor. And that sometimes the biggest lesson in life is not how to rise, but how to keep moving forward when there is no way back. If Randy Travis's story makes you fall silent, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a way of cherishing a man who continues to live even though he has lost the most important thing. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the people the world thinks it has fully understood.